Hey, Michelle, did you want me to just start and
I,
kind of introduce everything?
I was just going to ask if you wanted to do a welcome and an intro to folks, and I'm ready to go
Yes.
whenever you are.
Okay,
Sounds good.
sounds good. We'll go ahead and get started. So, thanks everyone for attending this new training on post-disaster flood management support through the um, Disaster Recovery Act, Part 1206. And so, this is a new training that we've developed with Atkins Realis to um, introduce this bit of legislation that probably many people in Kansas aren't that familiar with. So we wanted to start introducing this as a new topic to hopefully help Kansas communities utilize it in the future. So we have Michelle Gilbert with Atkins Realis who's going to present on this new topic for us.
Thanks, Cheyenne. I really appreciate that. And I want to just caveat that I have a little bit of a cough today. So if I mute myself mid-sentence, it's so that I don't cough in everybody's ear. But again, thanks so much for the intro. I'm really pleased to be here. I've been in floodplain management about, let's see, I think about 15 years now. Prior to my work at Atkins Realis as a senior planner, doing floodplain management technical support, I was a state NFIP coordinator in the Pacific Northwest. So, sitting in a role similar to what Cheyenne does for all of you today. So, again, as Cheyenne mentioned, we're mostly going to talk about the DRRA 1206 and how it relates to major disaster declarations, to communities and their floodplain management responsibilities that happen both during blue sky and after an event. A little bit about how an event might rise to the level of what I'm going to call a capital D disaster, a major disaster declaration, and the kind of federal buckets of assistance that that opens up. We'll talk a little bit about the high level points of DRA 1206 and the elements of how communities can get reimbursed for various post disaster activities through FEMA's PA or public assistance program. So we'll start out with a little bit of background. We'll talk about the disaster declaration process, some of those components of DRA 1206, and then kind of wrap up with some, again, points to consider. But we'll start out with just kind of how this relates to your community's National Flood Insurance Program participation, right? Community responsibilities apply, both in blue sky, everyday permitting conditions, as well as, the responsibilities that you'll have after a disaster. But this really, for NFIP participating communities, they adopt and enforce a set of ordinances or regulations that meet or exceed those NFIP minimum standards outlined in federal code. And those apply to all development in your community's regulated floodplain or special flood hazard area or SFHA. And those regulations or ordinances are wrapped into standalone chapters or zoning codes or building codes or something similar. Communities have a couple of different ways that they can enact those, and the state has um, example ordinances for adoption. The reason I start with this slide is that not only does NFIP participation make federally backed flood insurance available for participating communities, it also makes disaster funding available for communities in times where that disaster declaration is enacted. And really, the underlying purpose of the National Flood Insurance Program, right, is to reduce future flood damages. So, building new construction smarter and safer, as well as repairing damaged structures. And so, the two definitions that I want to focus on today and how this relates to DRA 1206 is that those definitions for substantial improvement and substantial damage, right? Development is buildings as well as non building activities in the floodplain. But substantial improvement is any reconstruction, addition, or work on a structure that costs more than 50% of that structure's market value before that improvement or repair. Substantial damage is kind of the companion definition, and that's damage of any origin, not just a flood, but any damaging event that a structure sustains, where the cost of restoring or repairing that structure to the way it was before it was damaged by that flood or fire or high wind event or tornado or something like that would equal or exceed 50% of that structure's market value. And the reason this is important and why substantial damage activities are one of the things that are covered under this new policy under DRA 1206, is that repair of a substantially damaged building constitutes substantial improvement, and those structures need to be brought into compliance as though they were new construction. So conducting these substantial damage determinations is a really important part of a community's officials' responsibilities. So again, as part of those community responsibilities that are always present is, administering your program and your requirements, requiring permits for any special flood hazard area development. Anything proposed in the floodplain does require a permit, and maintaining those records and documentation is a key local responsibility. When there are damaging events, whether it's a single house or an entire neighborhood or something broader, doing those substantial damage assessments to take a look at those damaged structures when they're in the floodplain and see, is the damage to that structure something that's going to cross that 50% threshold or not? Providing that official notice of that percentage determination to the property owner, and then conducting and continuing permitting and compliance work that relates to that determination. So again, for those structures that have been determined to be substantially damaged, then the repairs get treated as new construction. And again, part of the permitting and the inspections that go along with that are part of verifying compliance with your floodplain ordinance or regulations. So again, these are parts of responsibilities during blue sky conditions, as well as after a damaging event or a big disaster. And the difference really is that after a larger event, that workload doesn't happen house by house, it happens neighborhood by neighborhood, or even areas that are larger. And this really means extra workload for local officials. There are additional permit administration and enforcement duties that you'll have, right? There might be potentially, again, many damaged buildings that quickly need assessed, infrastructure that needs looked at for safety standards, and the resources, and that means that the time, the field work, the administrative um, efforts and staff time to make those determinations out in the field, to issue those letters, to review any permits that come in for repairs, to do the inspections, to conduct outreach to communities and the public, and then again, any of that related administrative work. And so effective rebuilding really ensures that doing this extra workload ensures that structures are more protected, from future damage, again, by following those locally adopted codes and standards. So that's sort of the stage setting part of we're focusing in on a community's substantial damage responsibilities. And in the course of a really large event, how does a disaster, I'm going to again say sort of capital D disaster, how does one of those come about? If an event, a damaging event occurs, communities may have dozens or hundreds or thousands of structures that need repairs. And again, those really large events, it might be a local disaster, but when there's really large events, they can overwhelm local or state capacity to respond to that damaging incident. In those cases, it becomes apparent that there's something of a severity and a magnitude that the effective response is beyond the capabilities of a local community to handle on their own, or for the state to be able to handle, and it needs to roll up to federal support. The process for this really is that the locals contact the state, and the state will contact their FEMA regional office for support. And there's a period right after those events where there's these preliminary damage assessments, or PDAs. These are conducted on the ground to do some field work and collect information on what's the extent of this damaging incident, how much area was covered by impacted by the tornado, how many areas in the community were flooded, what types of assistance are needed, both for public infrastructure or for individuals in those impacted areas, in order to kind of recover from this damaging event. Those damages that get estimated immediately after event are tallied up, considered, and submitted with some other factors, again, in determining whether that disaster rises to that severity and magnitude that federal assistance is necessary. Again, I call this a capital D disaster because not all events really get to this level, but having that preliminary damage assessment is sort of part of the process that starts on that request. So using that PDA data, the state would, in those cases, submit a declaration request to the president through their FEMA regional office for that federal declaration, disaster declaration. The thresholds for turning on federal assistance, whether that's individual assistance grants or public assistance categories, there's thresholds that are involved in this, and I just wanted to sort of say that those are county specific. And basically what this means is depending on the amount of damage, damage value that's identified by that PDA data, by that initial field assessment, a county and the communities within a county might be approved for individual assistance categories, public assistance categories, or both, or part of one of those assistance categories. I've got some info on the next slide. But again, the PDA data is collected, the cost assessments are made, the declaration request is submitted to the federal government, and then the president has two types of disaster declarations that are provided for in the Stafford Act. And those two federal declaration types are either an emergency declaration, which is defined as any occasion or instance where the president feels determines that federal assistance is needed. And that opens limited public assistance or PA categories and limited individual assistance categories. Not all of the categories in both of those types of assistance. So limited IA might just be the individuals and housing program assistance, for example. Public assistance might just be debris removal and emergency protective measures, but not road and bridge repair or utilities or building repairs for public facilities. But major disaster declarations are larger. They're events of such severity that, again, it's beyond the combined capabilities of state and locals to respond. And that opens up some or all. Again, it depends on the size of the event of these public assistance categories. It may also open up individual assistance categories for individuals. But community local governments would receive assistance through the PA side of that. So a major disaster declaration provides a wider range of federal assistance programs, including funds for both emergency work and permanent work. And the DRA 1206 component for permanent work and permanent repairs is really about building code and floodplain management, administration, and enforcement. And so this is, if there's a disaster that reaches that major disaster declaration level, capital D, and it's categories C through G approved, that opens this bucket of federal money for substantial damage assessments and building code enforcement. And as Cheyenne mentioned, this is a relatively new element, and so communities may not have had a large scale event that would require them to be familiar with this. So that's why we want to just try and orient you to what this is, when it turns on, and some points to consider. So in 2018, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act amended a couple of sections of the Stafford Act. And essentially what this really does is authorizes FEMA to provide that assistance. So again, federal reimbursement assistance to state and local governments for doing these building code and floodplain enforcement activities. And that includes inspections for substantial damage compliance. And Section 406 specifies, base and overtime wages for the staff and the manpower needed to facilitate that implementation, those inspections, and any enforcement to make sure that compliance is happening. It also sets the time limit for a period of not more than 180 days after the major disaster declaration date. A little bit more about the work types eligible for reimbursement in a couple of slides, but really the intent of this policy issued in 2018 was to provide communities with a pathway to get financial resources to effectively administer and support their building codes and their floodplain management ordinances within that 180-day window, that period that really excuse me, that period that represents initial recovery from an event or from a disaster. So we're talking post-disaster activities like building inspections, permit application reviews, those substantial damage related elements, local communication, and permit documentation. So again, this, the idea is that this federal money, when it's a major disaster declaration, can help communities recover faster and help support community compliance with codes. So that again, we have rebuilding that's safer and stronger and smarter. So let's talk a little bit about the who and the when and the how for DRA 1206 funding eligibility, again, through the PA program. Communities who are in good standing with the National Flood Insurance Program are eligible. Participating communities that have that legal responsibility and authority for administering and enforcing their building codes and floodplain management ordinances or regulations, and that are included in that authorization for assistance when there is that major disaster declaration. So FEMA will not fund activities under this policy if there's a community that's been suspended from the NFIP or otherwise sanctioned for non-participation. So again, you've got to be participating in the NFIP not only to get federally backed flood insurance available in your community, but to get access to these post-disaster federal dollars. And as that 2018 policy that updates 406 of the Stafford Act, it sets that 180-day window. So this is, eligible work starting on when the identified incident starts, and up to 180 days following the date of that major disaster declaration. So this isn't going to cover your activities for the year and a half after the disaster declaration date, but within that 180 day of the disaster declaration. And the next slide really underscores that the declaration date isn't necessarily, it can sometimes be rapid if it's a clear pathway to getting that disaster declaration, but sometimes it does inherently just take a little bit of time to go through that process. So I pulled an example from this FEMA region from the last few years, showing that sometimes this can happen in a matter of weeks, but sometimes it takes a matter of months. So, for example, if there is that's why the back date to the first date of the disaster event is important and relevant. This is also going to underscore my next point of why it's important to keep good records starting when your response to the event starts for eventual potential reimbursement. So let's say we had a flooding incident in the middle of May that overwhelmed that state and local capacity. There's some initial local and state emergency actions that are happening, and we're realizing that that's going to take a lot more time and resources to fully and properly recover from. And so by July, those PDA assessments have been done. That data has been collected. The costs and the assessment of how much is going to take to really recover from this are gathered and submitted to the federal government for a disaster declaration request. And maybe that's the end of July or early August. In this particular example, like within the month, then that major disaster declaration was issued. And if that opens up the appropriate PA categories that DRA 1206 is included in, then from this disaster declaration date back to the first date of the incident that's identified in the disaster declaration, forward 180 days from the declaration date. So back to when it started, all the work that you're doing here to do recovery, you're not sure if you're going to get reimbursed or if that DRA 1206 funding is even going to open up until that major disaster declaration gets issued. But obviously the work has to happen as rapidly as possible. But know that once that major disaster declaration is issued and that PA category is opened, that unlocks that possibility for eligible work to be reimbursed back to this date and up to 180 days from that disaster declaration. It doesn't go beyond that. So, activities the next summer or beyond that 180-day window are no longer eligible for reimbursement under that PA. So that's the who and the what, and the how and the how much is really, it's a reimbursement, not an upfront grant, but those funds for reimbursement are distributed through the PA program at a standard federal cost share for permanent work. So depending on your community, that's either 75% federal cost share with the community doing the other 25%, or it's that 90% cost share. And again, the applicant's responsible for the remainder. It is reimbursement, so you pay for the work up front. You keep good records and good receipts. So the record keeping piece is really important for understanding what might be eligible, how to log it, and tracking that even before this disaster declaration gets issued, so that you don't have to go back and try and recreate logs and records months afterwards. So it's important, again, just generally to plan for a disaster before one happens, right? Take time now to think about your standard operating procedures for how, if a big event happens and you have to do dozens or hundreds of substantial damage determinations, you have to do a lot of field work, maybe you have to hire additional staff. How are you going to accomplish those types of things? Some communities have the capacity to handle that all in-house or do it across training staff across multiple departments. Some communities, or many communities, will want to establish memorandums of understanding or mutual aid agreements or other kind of support agreements with neighboring communities, maybe your neighboring county, and you can enter into an MOU and have an agreement to assist yourselves if one of those disasters really does overwhelm one or the other. Hiring outside vendors to assist is also something that can get rolled up into eligible work for reimbursement. So really the point of this slide is that good record keeping and a plan in advance is really critical for that reimbursement. So again, those declarations might not always happen right immediately, but start as soon as you are starting your recovery work, start logging what you're doing. So that might mean, sign-in sheets for the folks that you're giving just-in-time training to, or activity and mileage logs, receipts for field equipment and safety equipment, all of those types of things, so that you have a good sense for the kinds of work that you've been doing. And the kinds of work that are eligible are outlined we'll provide one of these handouts. We'll provide a number of handouts after this class. I don't have the ability to attach them to this Zoom meeting for some reason, but there's a FEMA policy and a number of fact sheets that sort of go along with this that outline that the categories of work that are eligible for reimbursement under the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018 are things like building code administration, so staff time to review and process building permits, provide and attend training, conduct outreach to the public, and establish those inspection processes and carry out that work. Doing code enforcement, inspections, initial assessments, post-permitting inspections for work that's being conducted, carrying out corrective actions for work that's discovered that's happened without a permit, reviewing and issuing relevant documentation like elevation certificates that can all be eligible for reimbursement under DRA 1206. Floodplain ordinance administration and enforcement, and again, substantial damage determinations. So I've got a slide for each of these. And again, lots of lists of these and additional guidance are actually available in the PA policy guidance for Kansas, from FEMA, and we also helped Kansas build a couple of handouts as well. Then we'll provide those to you after this training. That again go through some examples of eligible work under these different kinds of categories the DRA 1206 policy talks about. Um, FEMA even says right on their policy that these aren't necessarily an exhaustive list. Other activities can be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. And then they also provide, and I'll show that here shortly, a sense of some of the ineligible work. But again, the eligible work categories are things that have to do with um, buildings and structures damaged by the disaster event that are in the special flood hazard area and that are directly related to this post-disaster recovery and that initial recovery period within that 180-day window. So again, this can be staff time, this can be training, this can be field inspections, this is documentation, administrative support for contracting, administrative support for providing mailings, any of that kind of things that relate to the disaster recovery work you might have to be doing. Similarly, with the floodplain management ordinance administration and enforcement, there's a lot of overlap here between those two, categories, if you will. But think about the things that you'd be doing to administer the standards for development. Issuing the permits for that repair work, hiring and training staff to go out and do a bunch of those. Because again, if you've got that permit load where instead of one or two houses at a time, you now have entire neighborhoods that are all trying to do the same thing at the same time. People want to get their repairs going and get back into their structures. You need to make sure that those SD assessments are done and that those permits are issued and that the inspections are all happening on the timelines that they need to be. And that's when they all happen all at once. It's usually more than standard staff can handle. And so hiring and training and certifying surge staff or support staff to do those things is eligible work. Basically, can you bring in help? Yes, you can under DRA 1206. Again, providing that information and outreach, taking a look at map data. Maybe this is additional GIS time or other data collection elements can all be eligible for reimbursement. And for existing buildings located in those areas regulated by your ordinance, so again, your special flood hazard areas, some of the examples of eligible work related to doing those substantial damage determinations are again, the cost information on the repairs, those initial damage assessments, time spent using the SDE tool or comparable data collection software, plugging in the percent damages for buildings, going through and reviewing full costs of work when permits do come in, collecting the market value of structures from your assessors or tax office, and plugging all that data in, maintaining those records, reviewing and making those determinations, taking a look at appeals that landowners will come back with and say, no, here are my full costs of work. The additional time spent to review and adjudicate and resolve those, again, when there's dozens or hundreds coming in at the same time, can all be eligible for reimbursement. And the eligible work, again, like I said, that's staff time, but that can also be your equipment time, safety equipment, field equipment, clipboards, notebooks, laptops, gloves, high-vis vests, vehicle usage for conducting those assessments, mileage, gas, extra vehicle rentals, travel costs and things for extra hires for those contracted or surge staff, or your neighbors through an MOU. So work that's executed to do this initial recovery for after a disaster. Again, that work might be done entirely in-house, or it might be executed through interstate or interlocal mutual aid agreements or memorandums of understanding, similar support types of agreements. Those can all be eligible for PA reimbursement. And so we've supported the state of Kansas with developing an MOU template that communities can use. And you can establish these mechanisms in advance of the next disaster. You can have a standing one, or you can use a template like this and modify it to be specific to a particular disaster event. But having these established, considered before a disaster event happens, helps you to be ready to move quickly and accomplish a lot more within that initial 180-day window. It allows you to reach out to your neighbors to get those kinds of supporting assistance. You can modify these agreements, and we've developed this template that's informed by state statute. So the Kansas Interstate Emergency Mutual Aid Act. Those types of things were considered when building this template. And Cheyenne, I believe these are gonna is going to put those on the state's website. Again, this provides a format for that MOU. It's adaptable to a specific event or a standing agreement between participating communities or political subdivisions. So just another resource for planning ahead before a disaster does occur, so that you're ready to to respond and move more quickly and accomplish a lot of this work, and plan to log it for reimbursement. And again, thinking about your documentation, good record keeping is critical for all kinds of things about floodplain management, and it's especially critical for reimbursement. It's a lot easier to log and save your records, your receipts, your things as you go. Think about a process for how you do that, and what additional staff or or uh, you know computer or logistical support you might need, or these records can be kept digitally or in paper, but good record keeping in some format or another will help you. Again, knowing that a lot of your work is gonna happen inherently between or right after that event actually occurs. And if it takes a little while for that major disaster declaration to appear, you can then use all of your good record keeping that you've done up until that disaster happens. You don't have to go back and spend time while you're still in recovery recreating your logs so that you can get your reimbursement. And again, that documentation, once that major disaster declaration happens, reimbursements for documented work that meets those eligible categories gets submitted through the FEMA PA grants portal. And FEMA's guidance is really just sort of relayed here, but that documentation should describe the specific activities and connect how it relates to those eligible work categories. So, your documentation really should cover when this work was done, so that it was in the 180-day window, where it was done, so that it was in the floodplain, and related to disaster impacted areas, and who did it, because there's sometimes a little bit of nuance to parts of staff time that are covered. So the evidence of the activities being claimed are related to incident related damage, right? Were these addresses in an area that was damaged by the flooding, or were these addresses in another area not related? That makes them ineligible. You want to make sure that the activities being claimed are related to areas where the damage or the incident happened and impacted things. Similarly, for addresses where enforcement activities took place, you want to make sure that they're connecting the damages and the work done to recover from those damages to the incident that the disaster declaration is for. You're going to provide estimated or actual cost information, logs, sign-in sheets, timesheets, receipts for field gear and safety equipment, costs for mailing SD letters, public outreach costs, putting things on websites, printing out mailers to have at the permit counter, those kinds of things. There are some items that the policy lists as not eligible for reimbursement. Again, permit review activities associated with non-disaster damage structures, or other permit activities that aren't disaster related. Have to get sort of separated out from that. So just because there's been a disaster declaration doesn't mean that now all permitting work is eligible for reimbursement. You have to kind of specify and figure out how to connect the impacted addresses and the impacted areas to the work being done. And then general code update and adoption activities are one of the types of things that's not actually eligible, because that's not specific to disaster recovery, even though updating building codes and zoning codes and those things lead to better and smarter development after an event. They aren't specific to an event recovery. So there are a couple of things to watch out for ineligible work. And again, those are outlined some more in detailed FEMA policy, as well as you can look at the public assistance guidance that's available in FEMA's PA grants policy guide. And again, this really falls under that PA categories for permanent work, so categories C through G of PA. Excuse me. So just again, briefly, there is a little bit of nuance to this. So when you do start to lay out your plans for how you're going to cover those types of things, and some of the points to keep in mind for those categories of eligible work is labor costs is one of those items that it mentions that there's a little bit of nuance to. If there's extra hires, all of their time can be covered. But if there's budgeted employees, only their overtime can be covered. FEMA's policy issue notes that it can't reimburse labor costs associated with straight time for budgeted employees. So a little bit of nuance to this, but broadly, there are lots of different activities that can be covered under DRA 1206. And then I'll just wanted to spend the latter part of this training just kind of connecting this to that reminder of those post-disaster responsibilities. And again, the community's disaster recovery work is always present, even if something doesn't rise to the level of that capital D disaster. So after locally damaging events, the community has lots of those, that workload is always present. It's just that in an event that rises to the level of that federally declared disaster, all of these roles and responsibilities happen at such a larger scale that it's necessary to bring in additional support to enact those MOUs, to reach out to your neighbors, to help you do all of this work. But in smaller events, all this work still needs to be done. You'll need to communicate with your elected officials about where a damaging event has happened. Maybe it's just a few houses, or maybe it's a smaller stream, or maybe it's something some smaller storm that impacted some structures but doesn't rise to that level of federal disaster. You're still going to go out and make sure you understand where the damages are. Reach out to your neighbors if you need to, through those formal agreements. Make sure that you're proactively or rapidly assessing damages, and if it's in the special flood hazard area, conducting those substantial damage assessments. You're proactively going out and making those percentage determinations. You're not waiting for somebody to come to you with a permit, because if somebody with a damaged house doesn't come in for a permit and you're waiting for a permit to do that SD trigger, you're going to miss things, and you're going to end up with compliance issues that you're chasing later. So by proactively going out as soon as possible and doing those substantial damage determinations when there's a damaging event in your community, this helps you get ahead of it, so that when permits for repair work come in, you're prepared to do that 50% calculation. Again, public messaging, communication with electeds, but again, communication with your public helps remind property owners of those post-disaster permitting requirements. Remember, you can waive permitting fees after a disaster, but you can't waive the permitting requirements. Permits are always required for work in the special flood hazard area. Collecting that market value of structures regularly for your community can help you be prepared. Like having that data ahead of time and keeping it up to date can help you be prepared to quickly put it into, like, using the SDE tool or some other similar tool so that you have those standard market values ready to compare against the cost of work to repair a structure, so you can do those 50% calculations more quickly and efficiently. So think about working with your assessors or your tax office to find ways to capture those standard numbers and collect those and keep your data up to date, so that you don't have so that that's not one more thing you have to do when a disaster does strike. You just have those data sets ready. Same thing with the GIS layers. Um, Again, that full cost of work and market value percentages, providing those official notices to property owners, whether something reaches that 50% threshold or not. That letter is important for them either way, for accessing certain things out of their flood insurance policy. And then again, for work that is done to repair a substantially damaged structure, that has to meet the requirements in a community for new construction. And that may, as we'll see in a couple of slides, impact how that repair work is done. Again, for folks who might be new to this or need a refresher, if the structure is in the special flood hazard area, then you will look at the full cost of work to do the improvement or repairs to that structure. Again, for substantial damage, it's damage of any origin, not just a flood in the floodplain. So the cost of that work divided by the market value of just the structure, not the structure and the land, but just the market value of the building. If that equals or exceeds 50% of that structure's market value, that structure is considered substantially damaged. Work to repair it is automatically substantial improvement and has to meet the standards for new construction. Hmm. Okay, so this is a worksheet from the FEMA Substantial Improvement, Substantial Damage Desk Reference. So a worksheet like this one is a good example of something that communities can use and fill out while they're in the field. It's maybe a couple extra steps from windshield assessments, but you might be able to, when you're doing those preliminary, neighborhood assessments, you can do something like this to really give you the early cut at heavily percent damaged structures or neighborhoods or areas. This gives you an early cut at the buildings that are very clearly a yes in the substantial damage category versus ones that are sort of clearly a no, this isn't going to rise to that level of 50% threshold. It lets you whittle down to the 40 to 60% structures that kind of need that closer dollar determination, where you have market value of the structure and really needing to figure out what the actual total cost of work is for repairs inside and outside the building. Begin that field work again as soon as it's possible to safely do so after an event occurs. Don't wait for property owners to come to you with repair permits, because by then you'll have sort of missed some of the percent damage indicators that are on the ground. That consistent and timely data capture is really important. It helps you make those determinations and be ready to issue those permits. Keeping that with your property's permit files helps you do that record keeping. And the SDE tool is another resource that you can use to kind of rapidly and in a standardized way do that data collection. You can follow the percent damage for various construction elements, get you those initial categorizations and numbers, so that you can make defensible determinations for whether a building meets that NFIP criteria for substantial damage or substantial improvement. You can add photographs and lat long coordinates and addresses into the tool, do those structure assessments within the tool, and further kind of define the type of structure being inspected, residential, non-residential, connect to GIS data and those types of things. And then different construction elements, 12 different construction element categories for residential structures, and I think a half dozen for non-residential structures. And then the tool will export a standardized way of getting to that that calculation. So this is a handy tool, and it's a free tool from FEMA that there's trainings on how to use that tool as well to support you in making those substantial damage determinations. And then again, those determination letters go out for both the yeses and the nos. And for yeses that work on existing buildings that is substantial damage repair, that building has to meet the standards for new construction, which can impact how they accomplish the repairs. More about this in the SISD desk reference from FEMA. But again, for buildings that were built, maybe before the map in a community existed, or before the base flood elevation changed in the latest map. If you've got buildings that were built, lower than today's base flood elevation that's on your map, lower than the BFE plus 1 foot of freeboard anywhere in your community special flood hazard area in Kansas, then repairing that structure means they have to bring the lowest floor into compliance with current standards. So basically, you can't build it back the way it was if the way it was isn't in line with the current rules. And solutions that are outlined in the SISD desk reference show, that the options and the solutions for a given building depend on a couple of different things: what flood zone it's in. Y'all don't have to worry about VE zone or coastal construction, but there are elements, foundation types will depend on things like flood zone. It also depends on whether the building's residential or non-residential. It depends on, some of the parts of, like, if you're only repairing a part of a building, or um, lateral versus interior repairs, and what that does to foundation elements. There's additional trainings that cover SI and SD more in depth, but just comparing or connecting that back to this DRA 1206 idea that the inspections and the compliance work that goes along with this, happen even when there's not a major disaster, but there's a lot of them that probably happen when there is a major disaster, and that these are the kinds of things that you're responsible for doing anyway that are connected to DRA 1206 reimbursement funding. Enforcement, it's a responsibility with or without a disaster declaration. It may include things like, additional site inspections or correspondence with property owners who've done something either without a permit or not in compliance with the permit as issued. And so, there might be field work, there might be meetings, there might be the issuance of formal notification letters, or legal recourse, any of those, mailing costs or costs associated with legal proceedings to adjudicate those kinds of things, are something that, in the case of a major disaster declaration, can be reimbursed, but are still something that falls under a local community's responsibility to, enforce its adopted floodplain ordinance and regulations. Wanted to plug again that the state, in its various toolkits, has a lot of really good resources that are already compiled for a lot of different things the community needs to be thinking about in terms of its post-disaster permitting and its substantial damage determination work. And so the idea with today's presentation really was to show you that in the case of a really big disaster, there is a federal bucket of reimbursement money that opens up, that it's important to keep good records, that's important to kind of make a plan for how you're going to accomplish a workload like this quickly, and how you're going to record and document the kinds of work that you're doing that you can get reimbursed for. Again, that MOU template in development will be made available to Kansas communities. And I'll also plug that there are a lot of additional FEMA publications that can help you navigate understanding, how disaster grants work in general, how the FEMA PA program works, and some additional frequently asked questions about DRA 1206. So again, you know, we want you to think about how to be ready for an event before it happens. Make your plans. Think about your standard procedures. Collect some of that relevant data, like your market values and GIS data, if you can. Establish links and MOUs with your neighbors. Know that the things that you have to do every day, you'll probably have lots more to do, or lots of them to do all at once in a disaster. And if it's a really big event and that capital D disaster gets declared, it opens up these funding pathways. And while you're responsible for it, you're not alone. There are those state and federal technical resources. With that, I will pass it over to Cheyenne. I want to say thanks very much, everybody, for your attention. If you do have questions, type them into the chat, and I'll either do my best to answer them or point you to the resources that we'll be handing out after the session today via email. So I hope that was useful. I hope you learned something new about DRA 1206 and this new bucket of funding available since 2018. I hope that you never have a disaster where you have to use it, but I hope that you know that it's available if that event ever does happen. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Michelle. So I don't see anything in the chat as far as questions, but if anyone wants to come off mute and ask something, you're welcome to do that. In the meantime, I'm launching a poll just to see who would like a certificate following this class for the one approved CEC. And as Michelle said, we'll send out a follow-up email with those materials that have been developed.
Thanks, Ben. And thank you again, guys, for bearing with me in my sore throat today.
Give it a couple more seconds, then I'll end the poll. All right, there we go. Everyone's participated, so I will take those results and get those certificates to you guys. But other than that, thanks for being here, and I hope you guys have a great day.
Thank you, Cheyenne. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice week.
You too.